Welcome back to Thirsty Thursdays with Noah and Blake conversation. Noah, how are you doing today, buddy?
Hey man, I'm doing really well. I'm very excited to be speaking with our guest today. They are a fantastic podcast. I've enjoyed all of the ones that I've listened to. And one of the hosts is a part of my favorite brewery, Urban Artifact.
Yes, especially mine and especially my mom's. If you haven't heard, today we're talking with Mike Morgan, a UC professor, and Brett Coleman Baker, brewer of Urban Artifact and owner. How are you guys doing today?
Great.
Yeah, good. Thanks for having us. It's wonderful to be chatting with you guys on this Thirsty Thursday.
Mike, we're drinking out of a similar glass, although
Yes.
mine is a Mad Tree Thunder Snow, which I got from Kroger the other day.
I haven't drank Thunder Snow this year. It's great beer.
Yeah, I had never heard of it before, and so what happened? My girlfriend is a doctor at Children's Hospital, and she has a lot of other doctor friends, and so they had this wild idea of going to a cabin in the Kentucky
The Gorge.
Yes, thank you. They went to the Gorge, and I got to go along, of course. And we were selecting beer, and Thunder Snow just sounded fun, so I went for it.
That's a good camping cabin gorge beer.
Yeah,
for sure.
I felt the same way. Yeah.
You say you got to go along, of course, but I mean, really, it's good. Congrats.
Thank you.
If my wife were a doctor and hung out with a bunch of doctor friends, I probably wouldn't get to go anywhere with them.
Well, we are all blessed in our own way, I suppose.
Yeah. And I'm drinking actually a small batch of Urban Artifact, the apricot cobbler. It is absolutely amazing.
Hell yeah! Cheers to that.
Cheers.
So let's go ahead and get started here and talk to us a little bit about how the both of you guys got connected in the first place. Mike, I understand you do a little bit of education on beer, correct?
That's right. I teach several beer classes at UC. I also have been doing all kinds of beer things for a long time. I ran Bachfest for 10 years, and I've written two beer books, Over the Rhine When Beer Was King and Cincinnati Beer. And Brett and I have a new book coming out in May called Tanked in Cincinnati. So I write beer. I've done beer festivals. I teach beer. I'm a drunk. And it was actually class, though, where Brett and I met because I started bringing my beer class, one of them Hops and History, over to Urban Artifact. And so I got to know Brett a little bit. And it was actually that class and a dead woolly mammoth that really kind of brought all this together. Because there was this woolly mammoth that had been found somewhere in, the north of the Arctic in Russia, and it gave people smallpox. So I asked Brett, as a science guy, could the same thing happen with yeast? And he said, maybe.
Sure.
And and I asked the question because they had just found this pre-prohibition wood fermenter in a lagering cellar that had been sealed off for decades. So we decided to go search for yeast there, and that gave rise to Missing Link, the festival, and the beers, and our very first little documentary, and then all of that morphed into BrewSkies, snowballed.
Yeah, that's super cool that you guys do that. We actually had a conversation. I can't remember with who, but it was published on some podcast recently.
It's probably with Gnarly.
Yeah. Okay, so we were talking with Gnarly about Missing Link Festival and all of that, like with the yeast and stuff. So that sounds like we could go off on a tangent for personally half an hour at the very least, but we won't do that today. But maybe we'll have you on the Brewery Explorers to talk about that soon. But
I am going to crack open one that's a year old here in just a second.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah.
I won't tell you about it, but I am going to drink one of those. Ironically,
well, you can tell us if it's delicious.
So I got only one question about this yeast strain. So for people that have not been to Missing Link like I have, it's not because I haven't wanted to. Just things are always busy that weekend. But what does that yeast really taste like when you're drinking it? I've always wondered.
Well, that's actually kind of the fun thing about it. is it changes over time. You know, it's an old yeast. It wasn't like we have today where we have all this genetic analysis of the different yeast strains and everything's pure and, you know, kept well cultured, and we know exactly how it's going to behave and what flavors it's going to throw off and what it's going to do over time. This yeast, it doesn't attenuate very well early on, but it keeps working really slow. So early on, I get like a lot of like honey notes. It's pretty clean. It's a little sweet. It makes a really good, you know, if you want to make a sweeter IPA or just a golden ale. And then over time, it keeps chewing and it gets drier and drier and it gets a little bit funkier and it starts taking on some like Belgian phenolic characteristics. So it goes from like this beer that would be a pretty standardly made golden ale into like a Belgian golden strong just by giving it time. So that's been the most fun, is learning how this changes over time. And as a brewer, you know, do we want to release it young? Do we want to give it 6 months? Do we want to give it 9 months? Do we want to give it 3? And figuring out exactly what you want out of it. And we're still learning, which is, you know, all part of the whole thing.
So, Brett, excuse me, I don't have a degree or understanding of science really at all. So, what is it? I mean, I have a sourdough starter that I told our listeners for the Brewery Explorers about last week, but I know that like it's supposed to taste better over time. Is what about that makes? I mean, I realize that sourdough starter and yeast are different types of things, but it's all fermentation. So like what like why is it changing taste?
Well, that's a very loaded question because there's a
Oh,
lot of things.
okay.
In short, yeast is lazy, like all of us, right?
So we're
So
best
what they'll
friends.
do is they'll get into somewhere with a food source, sugar, and they'll eat up all the real easy sugars, it's glucose. And then from there, they start getting into the more complex sugars and up to some carbohydrates, depending on the yeast. But when they start getting into the more complex ones, when they start breaking it down, there's a whole lot of different chemical compounds and pathways where the yeast might just decide it doesn't want to. It doesn't decide. It's not obviously making decisions, but it just doesn't complete the reaction. If you take like a 6-chain sugar and start breaking it down, the more you break it down, the harder it's going to be for it to continue to break down. So what the yeast will do is it'll start breaking them down and then not want to mess with it anymore and go to something else. And when it only breaks it down a little bit, it leaves behind a lot of flavors that can taste bad or just aren't as good being left behind. But if you give that yeast enough time and it starts running out of more food and it starts looking really dire, it goes back to those scraps and cleans them up. And then that's why it gets better over time. It's because it's cleaning up the shit it made in the first place. It was just too lazy to do it initially.
Gotcha. Okay.
Now, there's obviously a lot of anthropomorphizing in that explanation, but you know, it tracks.
I liked the cleaning up its shit. It reminds me of like a child, so we'll go with that. It's all a perfect answer
Like
in my opinion.
22-year-old living in a dorm for the first time.
Exactly.
You know.
Yes.
So let's talk about BrewSkies. So how did the podcast start, and what sparked the idea?
Well, at the time, there wasn't anybody out there that had done a meaningful history of American craft beer, and we thought that that was a good idea for podcast. Although, actually, if you go back before that, we started podcasting like a bunch of douchebags started podcasting because of COVID. So we were working on a video project. We were trying to get a pilot out for a TV show, and COVID shut that down. And we thought, well, this is a great idea to actually go through the history of craft beer, and nobody else is out there doing it, and so we should. Now other people are, of course, but
And did you? I mean, it's very popular amongst all the people that we talk to in the beer community of Cincinnati. I'm assuming that it has a pretty national listenership too. Did you guys think that it would? I mean, obviously, craft beer is an international thing. Did you guys think it would be as like well received as it is?
We were hoping.
Sure.
We were hoping it was going to appeal to more than just local or just diehards. I think these stories of these founders they're not just beer stories. It's the story of the American dream and small business and manufacturing and these things that over time just don't make sense in our country anymore. So the fact that craft beer was able to do what they did when everything else was offshoring and moving to China or Mexico or anywhere but domestically, the fact that this industry sprang up based on manufacturing, based on creating something, based on chasing a small business dream, things that seem impossible this day and age. It really that's what attracted us to us in the first place, and that's why we're hoping it would have a broader appeal.
Okay, so we're gonna start a little backwards in your podcasting. We're gonna start with season 2 a little bit, then go into season 1 a little bit. So, what's the biggest thing you learned when you were doing your pre-prohibition talk, and what were some things you found interesting or kind of shocked you about that?
Well, for me, the saddest thing about are we talking prohibition or pre-prohibition?
We're starting with pre.
Pre. So the biggest thing that really blew my mind was the fact that there was basically a mini prohibition before prohibition, and it's just not something that gets talked about. In the 1880s, right? 70s,
1850s, you start seeing.
So this movement that was happening, pushing a prohibitionist movement before the prohibition that we all learn about, that was really crazy to me. And obviously that was born out of similar intentions that led to the 1920s prohibition. But the fact that this latent sentiment was in our country was shocking to me. I guess it makes sense in hindsight, but I always just thought prohibition kind of popped up out of nowhere, and then 6 months later we were doing it. But that was clearly not the case.
Yeah, and for me, I think what's fascinating about pre-prohibition, well, there's a lot, but the way the industry started to consolidate in the 1800s and how similar that looks to today is really pretty crazy.
What do you mean by that? Like today?
Well, I mean, today we have gone through this fantastic period of craft beer expanding and growing in numbers and continuing to be independent. But, we are also starting to see uh, some more consolidation in terms of even craft beer, but definitely with bigger companies. The whole merger, I mean, who the hell ever thought you wind up having Budweiser and Coors under the same umbrella? This just massive conglomeration of breweries, the fact that we've got like half a dozen huge multi-billion dollar multinational brewing corporations that control the vast majority of beer sales around the world. I think that's depressing, and I don't think it's economically healthy for the industry. And I think that we're seeing more craft breweries kind of succumb to the need to merge, whether it's Dogfish Head and Sam Adams at that scale, or it's just some of the smaller ones we've seen lately, or it's the ones that get bought up, which started with Red Hook a long time ago, but it's occasionally happening. I mean, Platform, AB bought that and ran it into the ground, and
Well,
the
even
Sapporo assholes.
you can even look at Canarchy, where that was just a bunch of breweries coming together, craft breweries coming together to be better together, right? And then they got bought out by Monster Energy. So, yeah, it seems like you can't win. The global corporate elite is going to get you no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
Money always wins.
So, what do you mean by how did when you were talking about pre-prohibition? How did it really start going before people realized what was going on? Or
What was that like? What did that consolidation look like?
yeah, like you were saying, prohibition started before the 1920s. So,
Oh, yeah. So like in starting in the 1850s and moving through the mid to late 1800s, there was prohibitionist movements picking up steam, and there was actually a couple states that did enact their own prohibition before we did it federally. They didn't last long, obviously, but for the same reasons that prohibition kind of really took hold on in the 1920s, the issue was that men were just getting way too drunk on way too cheap a whiskey. I mean, people were drinking ungodly amounts of hard alcohol for most of the day, get done doing hard labor, go to the pub, get wasted, and then come home and beat their wives. So that was really what led to this. Was basically it was a women's rights movement using prohibition as the tool to gain rights, the right to safety and all that shit. So because the government didn't have basically any control over the alcohol industry before prohibition, there was a lot of abuse on all sorts of levels. I mean, we're talking tied houses and stuff on a corporate level, down to, on the individual level with people basically being massive alcoholics.
So what were some of the styles during that time? Is there any styles that survived to today, or
one style that I really like that it's fun because it's a little contentious is the Kentucky Common. Steam beer is another one out west with Anchor and stuff, and I'll let Mike talk to that one. But for the Kentucky Common, this was basically, it's your standard pub ale, right? Common is another name for pub ale. It's just shit that's going to be on tap at basically any place you go to. Breweries are making it, shipping it out young. Now, the thing with the Kentucky Common, it was made with corn and whatever grains you could have available to you, rye or whatever. It was often made a little bit amber color, not very much hops, and it was shipped usually within like 5 days of fermentation. So super young. It would go to the pub. This was back when pubs in America used to have publicans, someone who could actually handle the finishing of a beer and get it up to cask carbonation and all that stuff, which is a long lost art. It's dying in the UK even, where it comes from. But anyway, what would happen with these Kentucky Commons is that, you're only making a beer in the brewery for like 5 days and you're shipping it out. And so if the publican sits on it, they had a habit of starting to go sour. Because this was back in the day, like we didn't even know what microbes were. Like Louis Pasteur didn't even find out that yeast was making beer until like the 1860s, which is crazy. That's like 150 years ago. That's like so modern. So it would go sour. So now, modern days, when we're looking at the Kentucky Common historical style, there's people out there who are like, well, I want to look at the intent of the brewer, and they didn't mean it to be sour, so Kentucky Commons can't be sour. And then there's other people out like they're like me. I'm like, I don't give a shit. You want to make it sour? They were a lot of times they probably were because they sat at the bar or whatever. So like to me, if you want to make a historically accurate Kentucky Common and have it be a little tart, that's okay. So I think that one's really fun, and it applies here regionally to us as well. And it's not really a style you see anymore, but steam beer I think is the other really big one. And, tied to Anchor and all that stuff. So I don't know, Mike, if you want to add to that one at all. Or
steam beer is definitely another one of those styles that has kind of stayed true. And it was also made out of convenience and necessity. You were using lager yeast without proper lagering conditions. So your attenuation was a little bit different. It produces this kind of funky beer. And Berliner Weiss too, actually.
Yeah, Berliner Weiss is
that's
big.
similar to. I can't base this on actual history, but I've always kind of assumed that Berliner Weiss was born out of, oh man, we accidentally screwed up this batch of beer and it's sour.
All our beers keep coming out sour. What do we do?
Let's blend it with some stuff and make a style out of it. So, but I mean, we had most of the beers that we have now. Then the issue was that in the United States, as soon as we could make a lighter bodied, less flavorful, more yellow beer, we kept running to that, harder and harder and harder. And when you look at styles prior to Prohibition, you start to see a reduction of styles. You also see a reduction in ABV, like standard ABV in beer styles. It goes from somewhere around 6 to 8% in like the 1890s to under 5% by the time we actually went into Prohibition. A lot of those beers were barely beers.
That's a tale as old as time too. The lightening of beer, like seltzer, to me was the end conclusion to this 10,000 year path of the lightening of beer flavors. Because at one point in time, all beer was smoked beer because that was the only way you could dry barley. And then at one point in time, most beers were dark beer because you couldn't roast the grain hot and fast enough. So you did it lower and slower so you would get darker colors. And over time, as technology allowed, and as our understanding of science allowed, we kept moving beer lighter and lighter and lighter, and people just wanted it lighter and lighter and lighter. And any chance we got to take more complexity and flavor out, we have. And it's kind of crazy how that's been true for thousands of years.
Yeah.
So speaking of Anchor, with them not surviving, but you see the breweries like Sierra Nevada and Sam Adams and others survive. What's the differences between those two surviving than Anchor that wasn't able to keep going?
Well, independence, first of all. I mean, Sierra Nevada is
Mm.
still independently family owned brewery, which is pretty damn crazy when you think about the size of it. But the Grossmans still own that brewery. And Sam Adams is publicly traded, but it's still an independent, publicly traded company. I mean, I suspect that if AB InBev bought Sam Adams, Boston Lager would probably be on the way out.
It's actually really impressive that Sam Adams and Boston Beer Company have been able to act as independent as they have, being a publicly traded company since basically day one.
Yeah.
Like they have truly continued to invest in things that if they were owned by AB and Bev would be getting slashed and burned left and right. It's really remarkable what Jim's done.
Although some
It's
of that is contractual, and I don't know the specifics of it, but Jim Cook has talked about the fact that when he took that company public, there is something in the charter, the organizational documents. I don't know what it says, what the specs are, but Cook continues to have some control. He has some say.
Oh yeah.
So that's part of it. I mean, he's not over there getting 100% of his way, but he has some sort of actual ability within that large publicly traded company to say, no, we're not doing that. You know, we're still making Boston Lager.
as someone who's not, I have no say in any breweries or anything. An independent beer company sounds more scary, I guess, than being owned by Anheuser-Busch or Ambev. And I'm just wondering, do you guys? And I realize that Urban Artifact is an independent brewery, so I don't want to offend you with this question. But do you guys think that there's a possibility for any independent brewery to have the success that like Sam Adams has if they were to start now? It just seems like it'd be a lot harder because Platform got bought by Ambev and then they went under, and also we're seeing companies that get purchased by these mega breweries, domestic breweries, and then fans sort of turn away from them because it's no longer craft beer, or sort of these stigmas that get thrown around at them. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it would be very, very hard to cut through the noise and be a financially sustainable business in this day and age and also break it that big. So like someone like Montucky, for instance, I don't know if you're familiar with that brand out of Montana, but they make cheap lager with hip, cool branding, and they give a bunch of money back. But they've basically been buying their way into success through marketing and sales tactics, not necessarily liquid. And they've run out of money and they've had to sell. So that path doesn't really work. Granted, that's one example. The other side is like, okay, you're making the best beer in the world, like let's say Jester King, for instance. But, what's the market cap for them? It's probably about what they're doing. I can't imagine they could even make 1,000,000 barrels like Sierra Nevada. So then you look at, okay, so what is even the path to get there? Is it like a Rheingeist type thing? Probably. And they're sitting at, 125,000 barrels. And I think they want to push past 150 this year, if not higher. But like 150 is still 10 times less than Sierra Nevada, which is a huge gap. And we're 10 times smaller than Rheingeist is.
Right.
So like, I don't see how anyone can do it. That's not to say the odds are zero, because can't be, but like,
But that's due what Ken Grossman did, and yeah, the times are different. But you know what else? 150,000 barrels of beer is a year, a shitload of money.
it is.
So
For sure.
it's not like that was kind of a compound question.
Right.
Can anybody be the next Sierra Nevada and stay independent? Probably not. Can you be Rheingeist and be those guys living a life that Brett and I would both really love to trade in? Yeah, you can.
Yeah. You mean
I'll
teaching
take either one
at
of those
UC
guys.
doesn't provide that kind of lifestyle?
I'm sure they're
No.
financially well off. They're doing okay. I mean, their business is worth $150 million at least, so I'm sure they're fine.
You know, one brewery I would love to learn the history about a little more is in Noah's hometown of Shafley when they got started in the background of St. Louis. I would love to hear how they handled all that because I have to imagine that was probably a hard thing. Oh, I'm going to build a brewery right in Hudger's backyard. You know,
There's a lot of cool stories in St. Louis, and Mike's been pushing St. Louis for a while for us to explore more.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know a lot about Schlafly, but I was there actually around Thanksgiving, and I know that they have a pretty cool history, and they were pretty early. So I think there's a good story there, but we don't know it yet, but we do want to ask it and tell it.
then you also have like Great Lakes. What I think Ohio sometimes forgets about how big are they?
Well, this last year they were bigger than Rheingeist, but I think Rheingeist is going to pass them. So they're about 125,000 barrels as well, like
Oh wow,
127, I think they did last year.
Wow.
They're going to be in one of the next new episodes of BrewSkies Happy Hour too.
cool.
Oh, okay, cool. Looking forward to
Yeah.
it.
So, with craft beer struggling right now, is there anything in history that shows us this is just a pattern that we'll get through this, or is this worse than sometimes, like in the past history?
History tells us that we're screwed.
Oh,
Oh, interesting. There's the headline.
So, I mean,
Yeah. How do I follow up
consolidation
with
has
that?
been the trend. The destruction of small business has been the trend. The thing that that really drew us to this, that Brett was talking about earlier, is all of these things about craft beer that really are sort of a social revolution. I mean, it is the only small business that in the past 50 years collectively took market share away from really huge multi-billion dollar corporations. And it was doing that, around about 2018. Then there was COVID. And now, we're seeing some problems with the industry post COVID, inflationary problems, everything the tap rooms had to go through during COVID. So I don't know. I mean, I think that if we can pull through and we can become a country that has a lot of neighborhood craft breweries, then that's going to be unprecedented. But it doesn't mean that it's impossible. And, I hope that's what we look like. I mean, I hope that we do buck historic trends.
The
Yeah.
industry is also facing a lot of pressure in the distributorship tier. Something that doesn't get talked about a lot is that, in the 70s and whatnot, there was a very small amount of um, breweries and a very large amount of distributors. So there was a law enacted, the marriage laws, where if you sign up with a distributor, your brewery is basically stuck with that distributor forever. And this was to protect all of the mom and pop distributorships. So Anheuser-Busch, they have thousands and thousands of distributors because they're basically on a county by county basis because that's how it was done back in the day. What's happened over time though is that these mom and pop distributorships, they want to retire, and the next generation might not want to take it on, so they sell, and they sell to a different distributor, a bigger one, and then they consolidate, and that was slowly happening. But what's happened is these last 10 years is it's really ramped up even further by COVID. COVID basically pushed a shitload of small family-owned distributorships into selling, forced them into selling. So what used to be 10,000 distributors and 70 breweries has now become 10,000 breweries and 70 distributors. So this balance of power has shifted entirely. And if you're a brewery, a small brewery, and you're in one of the 70 distributors, they probably have 5,000 breweries that they're selling. What are the odds that they're going to give a shit at all about your brewery? Basically none. They're not going to sell it. They'll fill sales for you, but they're not going to be out there selling like they used to do 30 years ago. So that is also really making the odds difficult for these breweries, is that these people just these people are getting into it, or these small breweries think they can expand and grow like you could in the early aughts. There's no opportunity there. It's all a battle, start to finish.
And it means a brewery like yours, you have to have people out there selling your beer and have a distributor who's
Yes.
taking a cut of the profits for doing basically nothing except driving a truck, which truck drivers should be paid, but the distributorship's not really adding anything to the game.
Not what it used to. It's tough. It makes it very tough.
So, well, also, I mean, speaking in unfortunate news for beer, right? There's also like, the new competition of these like, canned cocktails, or a lot of new non-alcoholic beer providers. My Instagram is just filled with sponsors like Hop Water and Go Brewing. What do you guys think of those? Like, do you think Urban Artifact is going to come up with like a Mai Tai in a can, or are you guys just going to have to sort of like fight your way through and hope that
Yes, I do.
it all clears?
It's hard to say. I'm not inclined to want to do that right now.
Sure. Well, I mean, it seems like you'd have to buy a whole new system to do it.
Yeah. You got to do a lot to be able to handle spirits, and I'm not inclined to want to do that. That's not to say we won't. Our hands might be tied at some point in time. You got to continue to bring products to the market that the market wants. You can't just keep doing what you're doing. So for us, it's always been finding a balance of brew what you want, but it also has to sell. And if it doesn't sell, stop brewing that, even if you want to. That's just how it is. So it's Founders always famous for their we brew what we want thing, but that's only half of it. You got to brew what you want, but it's also got to fucking sell. And if it doesn't sell, stop brewing that shit.
I also think for urban, coming from someone that loves going to Urban Artifact, your beers kind of fits into that mold already with with your fruitiness and stuff like that. I think that's where you guys benefit more than others that don't do the fruit beers and stuff like that. Especially like my mom. She doesn't like anything else but your sours and stuff like that. So it's like,
oh yeah, love to hear that. But yeah, Blake, you're right. It's for us. It's always been get rich in your niche, and find a thing, own it, and do that thing better than anyone else. It's something that we do with BrewSkies. We want to be, if you're coming to people for industry-based opinions, we want to be the most knowledgeable from a historical standpoint.
At least the most opinionated.
Yeah, well, that counts, right? And it's the same with our brewery. You can do everything for everyone, but no one's going to remember you for anything. And for us, we want to own fruit. So thank you, Blake, for recognizing that and saying as such.
You guys absolutely own fruit for sure. And that was also a really great segue towards our final questions here. So the BrewSkies has had a fantastic lineup in terms of guests, from people from Sierra Nevada to Jim Koch. I was just sort of wondering if you could tell us who some of your favorites were.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that those favorites, they fall into different categories. So the fact that we were able to talk to Ken Grossman or Fritz Maytag, I mean, that was absolutely amazing. Jim Koch, and it was crazy. Like, the timing on that really sucked. Brett had to be out of the country. For me, the single best experience being able to do that interview with Jim Koch in the studio. That was just astounding. But the interviews, even, like, some of my favorites have been the almost made it failure stories, like Uli Benovitz of Weeping Radish in North Carolina. That interview was so much fun. And Bill Owens, that came this close to franchising the brew pub model until the wheels came off. That guy was out of his friggin' mind.
You should hear the outtakes from that episode. It's fucking crazy. The fact that our producer Dan was able to cut that into anything coherent is, that interview was wild.
Yeah, so they've all actually been. That's been the fantastic thing about the ride of it, is that everybody that we have talked to, it's been a different experience from being a really smart conversation to being completely off the rails or smart and hilarious. So I've dug them all actually, and even the non-direct beer people. I mean, Maureen Ogle, the writer. Damn, we're gonna touch base with her again in the next half dozen episodes that we have planned coming up. So yeah,
Is there anyone that you guys have like
all.
wanted to reach out to that you guys haven't been able to reach yet?
We have been trying to get the founders of Brooklyn Brewery on for a little bit now, and that's been a little frustrating. We really, really want to interview one of the Bush family, the original Budweisers. Really been trying to get one of those guys on the line. We've done a really good job of pulling in a lot of the ones I've wanted to talk to. Now it's just bucket lists trying to hit breweries. It would be great to talk to someone from like Cantillon one day if we want to go overseas, take it to Europe or something. But like those are the two I think that stick out to me the most, though.
Schlafly is on the list. That Shell from Minnesota is on the list. Somebody from Rogue, maybe we've talked about. We're trying to reach out there. We want to do the Goose Island story. So we have a long list. There's a lot of people. I just reached out actually into the week to the guy that started Gordon Biersch, because we did that Bill Owens interview, of the guy that tried to franchise the brew pub model and didn't. And, Gordon Biersch and Rock Bottom were the first two businesses that really did that model. And actually both of them did good beer too. Like, most of the franchise brew pub model, the beer wasn't good and the concepts were douchey, but both of those actually turned out to be good breweries, and they're still humming along, or good brew pubs, rather.
Is there anyone from Moorline still around to talk to them, like the original?
Man, that also, so yeah, that's ironic. It's ironic because we wanted to start with, there's the Sugar Creek Moorline people, and there's Greg Hardman, that bought everything in 2004, had it in between. But we have really wanted to do that story starting from the beginning with this guy named Bob Pohl, whose idea it was to come up with Christian Moorline, the original Hudepohl craft beer. And that was 1981. And that's the same year as Sierra Nevada. So Hudepohl Brewing Company understood, there were people within that company that understood that they needed to pivot and that craft beer was the way to do it. And they had to use their smallness as a strength. And it was brilliant. And they had somewhere between 16 to 20 some state distribution with Little Kings at the time. So they could have done it and they should have done it. And why they didn't do it is a fascinating question, except it's like a black box. None of those people will talk to us about anything.
We've tried. And Mike has a tumultuous relationship with Greg, to say the least. So that's a weird past.
It's fine.
It's up and down. It's probably flat right now. But yeah, it's difficult. We've tried. Like, we know what happened, but we don't know how it happened. Right. And so saying what happened isn't nearly as compelling as being able to talk about how it happened. So we're still trying to figure that out. So that's a great question. Hopefully one day we'll be able to do the full 60 minutes version of Christian Moorline.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so how can people find you who have never followed you anywhere? How can people listen to you?
BrewSkies.beer will take you to the YouTube channel where you have both BrewSkies Happy Hour podcast as well as the weekly YouTube show we do. Barstool Perspective, we called it originally, then we changed the name, and then we changed it back. So it's Barstool Perspective again, and that's alcoholic news across the industry, not just beer, and we do that on a weekly basis.
Facebook as well. Facebook is a great place to find us. And then anywhere podcasts are found, you can download the podcast version. But you're going to get the most content on YouTube, Patreon as well. We put some stuff up occasionally on there. Obviously, who doesn't have Patreon anymore? But yeah, hopefully that answers the questions. Facebook, YouTube.
Okay.
Find us.
Well, we really love this. I can't thank you guys enough for even agreeing to come, but this has been awesome. Thank you guys so much.
Thank
you guys. This
Yeah.
has been great.
Yeah, thank y'all.
It's been a pleasure.
Cheers.
June 1st is Missing Link Fest. And so you can find us here then, actually. And we're also going to be releasing our new book that weekend.
Oh, great.
Okay, cool.
Super
Do we have a date on Missing Link yet?
June 1.
June 1. Okay.
Saturday, June 1.
Yep.
Amazing.
Noon. Urban Artifact.
All right.
Be there or be a dick.
We're going to end on that.